Hello, today having a look at the new FrostGrave box. This is the Cultists 2. This is a kit by North Star Games, and primarily used for FrostGrave, but they have a lot of use in other games as well. So having a look at them, you get 20 of them in a box, and they're all kind of raggedy, bandity looking types, so they can be used for Cultists, but they have a lot of kit bashing potential, and use in generic settings as well. Got 5 torsos in a sprue with connected legs, and you get a nice selection of horrible looking weaponry, as well as a few ranged options. And you get a load of different heads, in different styles, so you can have ones covered in bandages, or hooded and more kind of vanilla ones. Well, there's some zombie heads as well. You also get a few little greeble bits, and both left and right unarmed arms, so you could use them for NPCs or something I guess as well. Just on initial impression, I think these guys would be ideal for Turnip 28. You wouldn't even have to kit bash them, they sort of fit the aesthetic already, but they can also fit in generic fantasy settings. Due to the clothing and weaponry being fairly agnostic, they fit in a lot of different places. I reckon kit bash them with a few guns, you'd have some great post-apocalyptic stuff as well. Now that those have all been clipped, we can have a look at making some. So first off, taking the bases, attaching the torso and leg combinations to each of them, then letting that dry, so you have a nice stable base to work on from that point onwards. Next up, attaching the arms. There are a few pairs of arms, but you just need to remember which ones go with which. Unlike the FrostGrave kit, they don't mark them on the inside of the joint, but it's fairly obvious which go with which. I'm a big fan of the weapon designs in this kit. They all look like farm implements or something they grabbed and thrown together, and it has kind of like a Morkborg style to it, where everything's just a bit chaotic and medieval. One of the weapons is literally a bone with a nail stuck through it, which is a brave choice if you've not got anything better. I built up 2 sprues, then put the other 2 aside for later, so I'd have 10 guys, which almost gives me a full Turnip 28 fodder regiment. Normally I clip the integrated bases off, then just glue the base onto the feet, but this time taking some Vallejo ground texture paste and smoothing the transition between the 2 bases, similar to what I did on my Argatoria minis. This also helps match the scale for other mini designs, because FrostGrave tend to be slightly on the shorter side, by a millimetre or 2, so by keeping the integrated base, it makes it a little bit less jarring when you see them together. When the ground texture paste has gone transparent, that means it's dried, so taking some of the earth texture paste, I then went in and filled in any of the flat areas, or places where the resin had slightly pulled back and left a gap. You also get a nice difference of texture, as the earth paste is slightly finer than the ground paste, so you get a nice different kind of two-tone mud effect. To prime the minis I use black gesso, being careful not to obscure any detail and applying it too thickly. I prefer using black gesso to prime minis these days, as you get lovely coverage, and a nice matte finish to it as well. But the downside is you can obscure detail if you're not careful. After the priming layer, to establish some initial shadow and colour, I took a dark brown paint and an old knackered brush and gave it a sort of heavy-handed dry brush over the entire thing. Using tan paint, I then applied a light dry brush over the top of the entire model, hitting any of the highest areas of detail, and applying an overall zenithal brown highlight. After this I hit the exposed flesh with a light pink colour, just to pull out some of the highlights, and give me a base layer to work on later. For the weaponry I used a dark metallic silver. Using a very pale sand colour, I hit the horns, as well as hit the bandages and the fur trim around the minis. To add variation to the different coats and jackets and trousers, I took slightly thinned down brown paint of various shades and applied it over the different elements. So you keep the shading from the zenithal underneath, and you keep it in a nice autumnal palette. To avoid them being too much in a warm colour palette, I moved towards a brown-green and applied that over some of the shirts and trousers as well, but still keeping it in that kind of brown central palette. Taking watered down light paint, I then applied a highlight on the top layer of the model, just hitting the very top areas where it's facing directly upwards, so you get some fake lighting effect. Then to give a kind of leather impression, starting with the dark brown, then directly dry brushing a light tan colour over the top, so you get a lighter colour where the edges of the leather had frayed. I also gave a very light highlight to the flesh, just on the very edges of it, such as the nose and the chin. The remaining wood and brown features got a variety of brown paints applied to them, just so they wouldn't be the same colour as the leathers and the cloth and the hide and stuff. And using watered down black paint to add a bit more depth and colour to each of them. Using the same technique with blue and orange paint, so you get a build-up of rust and oxidization on the weaponry. And you have some nice pockmarks sculpted into the weaponry as well in places. I touched up the rims of the bases using the dark brown paint, although maybe green would have been better for that. Then moving back to the diluted paint, I took a deep red colour and started applying it around the fleshy areas to add a bit more warmth, and over areas of the bandages as well. Otherwise there's not much point having bandages. When applying blood effects like this, it's really tempting to go overboard and just add and smear the entire thing in red, but it's very much a case of less is more. Time for the best step, which is adding some tiny tufts. These ones are from Gamer Grass. They are the tiny 2mm tufts. I then built up 2 more guys using old FrostGrave bodies, so I could see how well the arms fit and whether the heads would be compatible. And they all look pretty good. That gives me a 12-man unit of fodder for turn at 28, armed with melee weapons. They found a windmill to defend, and they've taken service with the turnip pope. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope to catch you next time.